Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Rob, and thanks to all of you for joining us. When Rob and I decided some months ago to dedicate this February's presidential series to the presidency of Andrew Johnson, the first president in history to be impeached, we, of course, could have no idea that this talk this morning would take place on the morning after the second impeachment trial of President Trump, but so we find ourselves today. So a talk that would have been riveting at any time is especially so this morning. We're very pleased to have with us as our first speaker in the series, noted journalist and author Howard Means, as you heard. Earlier in his career, Howard served as a senior writer for and later as the senior editor of the Washingtonian magazine. He also served for a number of years as a member of the editorial board of the Orlando Sentinel, and he was also an op-ed columnist for the King Feature Syndicate. His books cover a wide range of topics, among them a biography of Colin Powell, a book on swimming, a book about the Kent State Massacre, a book titled Money and Power, The History of Business, and his most recent book, Johnny Appleseed, The Man, the Myth, and the American Story. Of course, this morning, we're talking about the book titled The Avenger Takes His Place, Andrew Johnson and the 45 Days That Changed the Nation. With that, please join me in welcoming Howard Means. Howard, over to you.
Thank you. Thrilled to be here. Very nice of you to have me. Clark was asking me earlier why I bothered to write a book about Andrew Johnson. And I got to thinking, I've been thinking about it some since I've been preparing for this. And I became interested during my years as a magazine journalist in people who, and events that become sort of that become lost in their own mythology, and I wanted to find out more about. I have a sort of inherent interest in failed presidencies. I grew up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and I went to James Buchanan Elementary School, and I lived half a block from Buchanan's home at Wheatland in Lancaster. So from childhood, I guess I've had an interest in failed presidencies. Johnson. So I started looking into Johnson, and the more I looked into him, the more the window that fascinated me was the 45 days between Lincoln's assassination and when Johnson declared the terms of peace. And so that's the book is itself, The Avenger Takes His Place, is a complete biography, but with a heavy emphasis on those 45 days. And just to start off, a quote from the New York Times, and this is from March 4, I think this, let me check my notes, not March 4, 1861. The Times was not yet the great gray lady of journalism, but it had been around 10 years. Its opinion mattered. And on March 4th of 1861, this is what it said about Andrew Johnson. His name is in every mouth today, and he is freely applauded as the greatest man of the age. Imagine that, Andrew Johnson. And so the question, I ran across that, and that really cemented my desire to write this book. It's such a far cry from the Andy Johnson that comes down to us today. And whenever I think of that Andy Johnson, I think of the National Portrait Gallery. Some of you may know it, it's the Smithsonian's building up off of the mall campus. And there's a hall of presidents up there. Every president has a portrait. And it's kind of an L-shaped thing, or maybe even U-shaped now. But there's a little corner of it which I think of as the boulevard of broken presidencies that has three portraits: Andy Johnson's, James Buchanan's, and Franklin Pierce. And they're stuck off in this corner. You have to work very hard to find them. So the question is, what went wrong with that presidency? How did he end up in the boulevard of broken presidency? And who really is this, to me, the most enigmatic of presidents in many ways? Let's start at the beginning. With the exception of the early planter presidents, and I guess a couple of Roosevelts, Bush 41 and 43, Jack Kennedy, and a few others, presidents like to stress their humble origins. But no American president out-humbles Andy Johnson. Johnson was born in Raleigh, North Carolina in December 1808. He was 3 when his father leapt in. His father was a tavern keeper. He was 3 when his father leapt into a pond to save some boaters that had overturned. The boaters lived. The father died of exposure later that month. I think that was in March. Johnson's mother remarried eventually, but she remarried into poverty and the family never escaped it. Andy Johnson never had a day of schooling. At 9, he was apprenticed to a tailor named Selby. And in theory, he was Selby's property for the next, until he was 21 years old. 5 years into apprenticeship, Johnson took off running with his brother Willie, and I think was one other guy, 2 other boys took off running. And Selby put out advertised a reward of $10 for Johnson's return, about $200 in current currency, which is a big award. But Johnson was never brought to bay. On the run, he plied the trade he'd learned from Selby. He became a tailor, and he worked out of shacks with wooden floors, and he earned forever after that among the highborn the ugly epithet of mudsill tailor. His meanderings finally brought him to Greenville, Tennessee when he was 18, and there he met and married poor and fatherless Eliza McCardle, also 18. And the next year, not yet 20, and still being taught to read and write by his wife, he was elected an alderman in Greenville. From 6 years later, he became mayor of Greenville. In 1842, he was elected, from there he moved on to the Tennessee legislature. In 1842, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. In 1858, he was elected to the Senate from Tennessee. And we know from a fellow Tennessean, Oliver Temple Perry. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me back up a moment. I should say that by the time he became a state legislator and a national legislature, he had escaped the poverty of his childhood. Prosperity followed on the heels of his political success. He sold his tailor business, and it was no longer a mudsill tailor shop. Invested in railroad stocks, started a newspaper to advance his political career, so politics was on his mind from an early age. We know from a fellow Tennessean, Oliver Temple Perry, who wrote a very nice long remembrance of Johnson, that Johnson stood 5'10". He weighed about 175 pounds. He was a man of superior physical strength. I have a photograph of him I'll try to show on the screen here. A photograph. This is I'm almost certain by Matthew Brady. I meant to check that, but I didn't. And that is Johnson to a T right there. The look, that scowl, everything about him. Johnson didn't have humor in his repertoire of emotions. He seldom smiled. If you look right above the eyes, the brows, everybody used to comment on those brows. And this is what Oliver Perry wrote about him. Above his eyes, at the point where phrenologists locate the reasoning faculties, were 2 remarkable bumps. On the whole, nature had stamped him a remarkable man. And so we have this cartoon image of him. I guess that's what I was trying to break through with this cartoon image of the president who was impeached and almost removed. It's no wonder Lincoln named him military governor of Eastern Tennessee not long after the war began. Johnson, in fact, had stumped for Breckinridge, the Democratic candidate, in the 1960 election. But that December of 1860, he went all in. I'm sorry, of 1860. I'm sorry. He went all in for the Union. He began throwing the word treason around on the Senate floor, and for the most part, the Northern press loved it. That's really what's behind the quote, the New York Times quote I started this with. What's more, Johnson was available in unfamiliar terrain, and important terrain. First of all, with Tennessee's secession, he had no state left to represent. Holding Eastern Tennessee was also of critical importance to the Union because it was central to supply lines to the deeper South. Johnson was also bullheaded and fearless. He was a man made for this kind of work, and he needed to be. He was widely considered a traitor to the South, obviously. Before Edmund Stanton, the Secretary of War, assigned Johnson to be the military governor of Tennessee, he was warned by one of his aides that if Johnson were to reappear in Tennessee, that he was almost certain to be killed. By 1866, Stanton, still secretary, would have preferred that Johnson had been killed at that point. He fervently wished that had happened. By then, the qualities that were Johnson's strength as a military governor were destroying his presidency, but that really gets ahead of the story. It was little wonder that Lincoln made him Johnson military governor of a key Southern toehold. It was even less of a surprise in some ways when the rail splitter asked the Mudsill Taylor to be his running mate in 1864. Lincoln feared that he might not prevail. George McClellan had set himself up as the peace candidate for the Democratic nomination for president. And he was appealing to Union voters, tired of the war, sick of the carnage, ready to let the Confederacy go its own way. The loss at Gettysburg, the failure to take Atlanta, any number of other bad turns on the battlefield, they all would have strengthened McClellan's hand and his argument. And so to that end, Lincoln, to buttress his own chances, the president announced a new coalition, the National Unity Party. And for a running mate, he crossed party lines and reached out to the one national politician who might have placed himself at greater physical risk during the war than any other, Andy Johnson. But to put Johnson on the 1864 ticket, Lincoln had to give the bum's rush to his first-term vice president, who was Hannibal Hamlin of Maine. And there the story gets interesting, particularly if you believe, as I do, that Washington, D.C. is the world capital of passive-aggressive behavior. Johnson arrived in D.C. on March 1, 1865. He was complaining of typhoid fever symptoms, and this was just days in advance of the inauguration. 3 days later, still feeling weak and waiting in Hannibal Hamlin's office for the inauguration festivities to begin, Johnson asked for his host for a bracing tumbler of whiskey. And Hamlin obliged. Hamlin poured and then poured his soon-to-be successor 2 more bracing tumblers of whiskey. A half an hour later, and still vice president for a few more minutes, Hamlin delivered some decorous remarks and then turned the podium over to Andy Johnson. And Johnson launched into an oration so rambling and brimming with resentment that Navy Secretary Gideon Welles turned to Stanton and said, "That man is either drunk or crazy." Whether or not Hamlin poured with malevolent intent, I don't know, and I don't know it's ever been determined, but drunk was the right call. As politicians are wont to do in such embarrassments, Johnson pled illness after the inauguration debacle, retired to the Silver Spring estate of Montgomery Blair, and didn't meet again with Abraham Lincoln until 6 weeks later on the afternoon of Maundy Thursday, 1865. The next morning, Lincoln was dead, and Andy Johnson assumed his office at maybe the most perilous crossroads in our nation's history. Let me stop here for a moment and just consider what actually happened that night in the early morning of April 14 and 15, 1865, and where the nation stood at that moment. Lee had surrendered only a week earlier. Jefferson Davis was in flight, headed towards Texas. Nearly 200,000 rebel soldiers remained under arms. 600,000 Americans north and south had died in the war, 10 times the fatalities in Vietnam. 1 in every 50 people in the land, equivalent to more than 6 million people as a percentage of the American population today. The economy of the South was in ruins. 4 million mostly illiterate slaves, former slaves, freed slaves, wandered its streets and country roads. Prison camps at Andersonville in Georgia, Cahaba in Alabama, elsewhere were disgorging unimaginable horrors. And John Wilkes Booth had just in effect turned the Republican presidency over to a lifetime Democrat who at the outset of the war had himself owned 5 slaves. Absolutely remarkable to think about. That, of course, was not Booth's intent. The plan was to assassinate Johnson as well, along with Secretary of State William Seward and Ulysses Grant, to cut off not only the head of government, but also some of its key limbs. Booth and his co-conspirators nearly succeeded with with Seward. He was attacked brutally at Blair House where he was living and knifed and barely survived. Grant by chance took off for Lincoln to visit his son, for Philadelphia to visit his son, and thus wasn't sitting beside Lincoln in Ford's Theater that night. Johnson's assassin, a guy named George Atzerodt, had been appointed to assassinate Johnson in his rooms at the Kirkwood House Hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue. And Atzerodt stopped for a drink on the way to steal his courage and ended up drinking his courage away. But you think at LBJ's swearing-in ceremony, and everybody, there's this. It was done aboard Air Force One at Love Field in Dallas, not long after Jack Kennedy was pronounced dead. And a devastated Jackie Kennedy stands hard by his president's side. For people my age, it's an unforgettable image. Despite the horrible events that just occurred, there was a promise the government would continue. Mary Todd Lincoln, under similar circumstances a century earlier, was having none of it. Booth had left a card for Andy Johnson, that is, at the hotel on the afternoon of the assassination. The card read, "Don't wish to disturb you. Are you at home?" Common sense would suggest that Booth was merely double checking on Johnson's location before sending the hapless Atzerodt to slay him. But Mrs. Lincoln took the card as evidence of Andy Johnson's complicity in the plot. "That miserable inebriate Johnson had cognizance of my husband's death," she wrote a friend. And to punish him, she refused to move out of the White House. Johnson's first month as president was spent living at Kirkwood House and working at a borrowed desk in the Treasury Department. Was Johnson a miserable inebriate? He was, to be sure, drunk at the worst of times, but the evidence of continued heavy tippling is scant at best. Lincoln assured his Treasury Secretary in his own homespun way after the inauguration debacle, quote, "I know Andy and he ain't no drunkard." The Treasury Secretary, after monitoring Johnson himself for a few months, agreed. Johnson's stump speeches had turned Johnson into an immoderate orator, but he was drunk in his own words, not on spirits. My own favorite evaluation comes from a reporter who covered Johnson during his time as military governor. Quote, "He drinks no more than a priest at his sacraments." I think we'll all agree that leaves some latitude for interpretation. While we're on first ladies, just a bit of a side, the one who succeeded Mary Todd Lincoln, Eliza McArdle Johnson, had no taste for Washington and no love for its highfalutin ways or its grand affairs. During the 16 years Andy Johnson served in the House and the Senate, Eliza managed to visit Washington exactly 2 times. She must have liked the number because during Johnson's 4 years in the White House, she came downstairs for formal events exactly 2 times, once for a children's birthday party and once to greet the Queen of Hawaii. Enough said, probably. For good or ill, with or without Mrs. Lincoln's blessing, Andrew Johnson was president, not Honest Abe, and it would be up to Johnson to determine, at least initially, the terms of peace. In the South, Johnson's succession was not taken as a good omen. It was taken rather as a sure prophecy of the ill years ahead. Jefferson Davis used to refer to Johnson simply as the beast. My favorite one is 17-year-old Emily LeConte, writing in her diary in Columbus, South Carolina, a few days after the murder, caught the spirit of the fallen Confederacy well. "Hooray," she wrote, "old Abraham Lincoln has been assassinated. Andy Johnson will succeed him. The rail splitter seceded by the drunken ass." Herman Melville summed up the general spirit of expectation well in a 2-liner that I used the title for my book. "They have killed him, the Avenger." They have killed him, the Forgiver. The Avenger takes his place. Vengeance, though, is exactly what many in the North, including the Republican radicals in the House and Senate, long for. And for them, Johnson was just the ticket. Lincoln was going to let the South up easy. Andy Johnson had been vowing for 4 years to stretch some rope and rope some necks. Lincoln had died on Good Friday. That Easter Sunday, many a Northern pulpit rang out with the message that the nation had been providentially delivered to a president more ready to exact the retribution necessary after 4 years of war. Even Ralph Waldo Emerson jumped on board, wondering in his journal, quote, "If it turns out on the unfolding of the web that Lincoln had reached the term, that the heroic deliverer could no longer serve, that what remained to be done required new and uncommitted hands. Yet Senator Ben Wade of Ohio had no doubt about the matter. Lincoln's body was barely cold when before Wade crowed to Andy Johnson, "By the gods, there will be no trouble now in running the government." Wade, as Johnson seemed to, had considerable rope in mind and many rebel necks to tighten it around. The desire for vengeance was certainly not universal in the North. It never is, obviously. Henry Ward Beecher, the most famous preacher of his day, Harriet Beecher Stowe's brother, a leader of the anti-slave movement, told his parishioners in Brooklyn that with the war's end, quote, "Now things are changed. The cause of the troubles removed, and it's become our privilege and duty, as it is my pleasure to plead for a large measure of goodwill and love towards all men." Which would it be then, vengeance or mercy? For 45 days, that question captivated the barely reunited nation through the search for Booth, through Lincoln's long funeral cortege, through the grand review of the Union armies that crammed Washington with something on the order of 250,000 marchers and onlookers, straight through May 29, when Johnson finally revealed his vision of the America that was to emerge from the slaughter. And it was basically Abraham Lincoln's plan to a T. Andy Johnson let him up easy. The rebel states would be required to assemble a convention of delegates, quote, "loyal to the United States and to no other," to repeal the ordinance of secession, repudiate all war debt, and outlaw slavery. As to who could vote for the delegates and in subsequent elections, Johnson set the bar at those eligible to vote in 1861. Individuals who had participated in the rebellion were to have all property rights restored, except as to slaves, in return for a simple oath to henceforth support, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, an oath we've heard a lot about in the last 6 days or so. 14 classes of individuals were exempted from this general amnesty, including civilian officials of the Confederate government, any rebel soldier educated at the public expense at West Point or Annapolis, pirates and raiders who had preyed on Union vessels, and all persons who had voluntarily participated in the Confederate cause and had estates valued in excess of $20,000, about $350,000 in current currency. Even to this accepted group, though, Johnson offered an olive branch. Special application may be made to the president for pardon, and such clemency will be liberally granted. Ben Wade, of course, was furious. No necks were to be stretched. Thaddeus Stevens was even more apoplectic. No black suffrage, no divvying up of the plantations among former slaves. Both men, along with radical Republicans, the whole felt double-crossed. But in fact, Andy Johnson was just being Andy Johnson. We know of at least one occasion when Johnson actually darkened the door of a place of worship. The Sunday when he sat himself down in pew 54 at St. John's Church, Lafayette Square, as of all presidents before and after since 1816. But Johnson on the whole had no use for religion and never joined a church. His Bible was the Constitution, the Union his rock and his salvation. And as Johnson read the Constitution, it made no provision for secession. The Confederacy, in fact, had never legally existed, and thus the states of which it pretended to consist had no need to be readmitted to the Union, since they had never left it. All that was needed was for the relationship between the rebel states and the abiding Union to be reset to pre-war conditions and to accept emancipation as ratified in the 13th Amendment. With Johnson, it was always about the Union, always about the Constitution, and always, too, finally about himself. Johnson yearned for respectability, but only on his own terms. He also seethed with class rage and seems never to have forgotten an insult. In his letters, he decried, quote, "the illegitimate, swaggering, bastard scrub aristocracy, the taunts and jeers I have been made to suffer, the money-loving, hypocritical, backbiting, Sunday-praying scoundrels of his own Greenville, Tennessee, and purse-proud Memphis, and highbrow Richmond, and wherever else he was still thought of as a mudsill tailor. Those are the ones who would have to appeal in person to him for clemency and amnesty, and come they did, from June to August 1865, just counting those from, here, I'm sorry, I lost my place. From June to August 1865, Johnson issued 5,300 pardons for residents of Alabama, North Carolina, Virginia alone, almost 60 petitioners a day, all courteously received at the White House, all pardoned and all restored to their proper place in the Union. The president became a slave to the process, and almost all those he spared then returned to their home states and began passing the black codes that made a mockery of Johnson's entire amnesty process. Johnson's Reconstruction was a disaster all of his own making. It was always his way or the highway. And in this instance, the highway went right into a brick wall. Andy Johnson was all for the yeomen, the laborers who lived by the sweat of their brow. In Tennessee, he had backed everything to give them a leg up, a little fun, public education, state fairs. He was for all of them. As president, he wanted to turn down James Smithson's gift. Instead of a museum in the mall, he wanted to construct a national industrial school. For the black yeoman, though, there was no leg up. Just like runaway slaves, Johnson had had a price put on his head when he split Selby the tailor. But he could never make that empathetic connection across the racial divide. That's really what he lacked, the ability to project beyond himself. Street smart as he was, Johnson was in some ways the easiest man in the world to set a trap for. And the Republicans did just that and baited it with Johnson's own inherited Secretary of War, Edmund Stanton. Stanton was more than a prominent member, a cabinet member. He was also the radical Republicans' very public mole within the Johnson and the cabinet, openly working with Ben Wade, Thaddeus Stevens, and others to undermine the president. Johnson despised Stanton. In the last days of the 39th Congress, at the opening of March 1867, the radicals moved to maximize the president's anger. Over Johnson's veto, Congress approved the Tenure of Office Act, forbidding any president from removing any official without the consent of Congress. It was a terrible piece of legislation, but the radicals knew the conflict animated the president and that he couldn't resist a fight. And 5 months later, on August 5th, Johnson struck back, asking for Stanton's resignation, and with that, the ball was officially on. The House, pretty much on cue, produced 11 articles of impeachment, 8 having to do with Stanton, who had barricaded himself in his office and refused to leave. And on March 5, 1868, the Senate met to consider the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. The Senate met to consider the impeachment of Andrew Johnson with the Honorable Ben Wade, President pro tem of the Senate, presiding. Not coincidentally, perhaps, in the absence of any vice president, Wade was also next in line for Andy Johnson's office. I'll leave it to your next speakers to flesh out that story and provide more insight and better analysis than I ever could. But let me leave you with this parting thought before we move on to questions. Abraham Lincoln, in the house of Abraham Lincoln's intellect were many mansions. Andy Johnson's intellect was not to be laughed at, but it was one room deep. And the consequences were tragic for himself and for the nation. Thanks.
Terrific, Howard. That's a tour de force. You really have whetted our appetite for even more. So we have a few questions and we'll have more, I know. So one question is, and you perhaps have answered this implicitly, one person asked whether Johnson can be considered a demagogue.
No, Johnson campaigned in 1860 for the Democratic nomination, 1868. There was elements of demagoguery to it, but I wouldn't say he was unyielding. There was much mockery made of him wanting to be a king, wanting to be a demagogue. Thomas Nast beat that drum pretty hard in his cartoons, but I did not find him demagogic, no.
What was his relationship, albeit short, with Lincoln? How would you characterize it?
Albeit short is the phrase. Well, you know, I think they campaigned well together. I mean, Lincoln did ask him to be his vice presidential. I mean, I think Lincoln admired his courage in battle. I mean, he was. Johnson, you know, there are stories that Johnson slept on a bed of revolvers at one time when he thought the military governor's office was about to be overrun. Johnson was just raw courage. But as I said, and it comes to me time and again, he had no capacity for compromise, and I think what Lincoln would have found hardest about him is he had no sense of humor whatsoever. Lincoln liked to tell a joke, and Johnson was stony-faced no matter what happened, and I think that must have made it hard for the two of them. But as his vice president, they had one meeting, when you think about it, on the in the morning, on the afternoon of Lincoln's assassination. Amazing, this fellow would become president under that circumstance.
You mentioned that Mrs. Lincoln thought that Johnson had something to do with the president's assassination. Yeah. Was that a widespread belief at the time?
It was wide enough. She pushed it fairly hard. I mean, she didn't hide the fact that she suspected that, and I think it became particularly rumored after he disappointed the radical Republicans. He made a lot of enemies very quickly when he did that. So yes, but there was, of course, there's no serious effort to, and I think that if George Zoderod had not drunk himself into a stupor and had tried to, I think he would have had a hard time taking Andy Johnson down. Johnson was a rock of a man. He's such a rock man. He returns to the Senate in 1872. Serves one last term. He dies during the course of the term. But he goes back, it's miserable conditions. He goes back to Tennessee. He gets off, he gets on a horse, and he starts riding for 4 hours across to get to Greenville. And the weather conditions are horrible, and he died of exposure eventually. Not then, but he died later of the exposure he suffered. So, yeah, I think Johnson, that's what Lincoln admired in Johnson.
Can you tell us a little bit about what foreign nations thought of Johnson during the course of his presidency? What was the attitude of other countries toward the Johnson administration?
I think the diplomatic corps found him coarse, and I think he did not have a particularly hard time with the British, the French. I would say, I mean, I didn't actually. An interesting question. I didn't actually examine that. I do know that in Washington, he was considered, a country rube, and had no taste for diplomatic receptions or for that life. Lincoln didn't have much taste for it either, frankly. Right. Yeah, but I can't really answer what diplomatic traffic was like on Johnson.
Lincoln, of course, was very sympathetic to Blacks in the United States, obviously, and had, you could argue, deep friendships with Douglas, for example.
Sure.
Could you talk a little bit about Johnson's attitudes toward Blacks, and did he have a similar relationship with the leading figures of the day in the Black community?
Had absolutely none. I mean, when the contrast between that, all all the weeping crowds outside the White House as Johnson is outside the hotel as Lincoln was dying and his body was brought back to the Capitol. There wasn't I don't think there was a tear shed in the Washington's Black community or the American Black community generally when African-American community when Johnson died. He was simply, as I said, he could never make the empathetic, I couldn't pronounce that word. He could never make the empathetic connection with his own history, with having been a runaway slave in essence. I mean, to the extent that he was a slave to Selby for 11 years, he could just never make that connection. And as he campaigned later on in 1868, it became quite evident that he was an open racist. There's just no question about it.
You mentioned Stanton, of course. What was his relationship like with the rest of the cabinet? Thinking, the team of rivals with Lincoln. What was the relationship generally between the?
His strongest one was with the Treasury Secretary, whose name is going to escape me for the moment, MC. So I apologize for that. In whose office he worked for the first month. It wasn't all that bad, I don't think. Gideon Wells got off to a poor start with him, but I think Wells eventually thought that it was after all, he did attempt to implement Lincoln's terms of peace. Now he attempted to implement in his own terms, and I didn't make that point earlier, but these people had to come to Johnson directly, personally, for pardons. the planters, that whole planting class. I mean, that was, they basically had to get on bended knee before him. I mean, that's what I mean, this is a whole thing about Washington. One of my theories, Washington as the world capital of passive aggressive behavior. This whole thing is kind of the world capital or an amazing exemplar of passive aggressive behavior in a way. But I don't think it was particularly troublesome relationship with others than Stanton. Stanton simply, dominated the other end of the room.
Got it.
Yeah.
And don't want to get you ahead of the other speakers, but just to talk a little bit more about the impeachment process, was it bipartisan, generally speaking?
Yeah, it was interesting. The question that was asked the other day, or after the vote was taken the other day, I think maybe CNN or MSNBC, I can't remember which one. So one of the people said, "Well, this was the most votes ever cast for impeachment." Well, there weren't as many states.
Right.
I mean, Edmund Ross saved Johnson Bacon by one vote. So yes, I mean, it was it was an interesting question. You could argue that Johnson should have been impeached because he did violate. He went directly against Congress, and he fired Stanton. He could not fire Stanton by the Tenure of Office Act. He was set up beautifully. They knew their man. They knew what he was going to do. He acted exactly according to script because he couldn't stop it. But as we've been told many times in the past a week or so, this is not a jury, operating by the usual rules.
Right.
And it was a setup. It was a complete setup. And so Edmund Ross did the right thing. There's no question about it in my mind. I hope you'll get a better argument on the other side from some of your people to follow. But to my mind, it was the right thing.
So history, the treatment in history of Johnson, could you talk a little bit more about that? People, I think, have focused more on him, obviously, in recent years with impeachment becoming more prominent. But generally speaking, could you talk about that?
Yeah, generally speaking, as treated by history, he belongs in the Boulevard of Broken Presidents at the National Portrait Gallery. Well, what did he accomplish? You could argue, and I think reasonably enough, that he did the right thing. I mean, his resolution of the terms of peace, they were Lincoln's terms of peace, and they would have been Lincoln terms of peace. Lincoln would have been much more nuanced in enforcing them. But let me read one thing which I skipped over because I was running out of time. But
Sure.
It's an interesting. This is where history saw him in September of 1866, 1.5 years into his office. And this is from Harper's Weekly. Quote, and Harper's Weekly was the Life magazine of its day. I mean, everybody read it, or the Time, whatever you want to say, since there are no national magazines. We've had 4 eminently critical presidential administrations. Washington's, in which the Constitution was first tested in operation. Jackson's, in which the Constitution was first seriously threatened. Lincoln's, which saw open rebellion against the Constitution. And Johnson's, in which it will be necessary to secure the peace of the country and the perfect allegiance of all its citizens, which has been obtained by military conquest. The effectiveness of Johnson's administration remains yet to be decided. Well, by then, in some ways, it really was, but it gives you a sense of the spot in history that Johnson held at that moment. Washington, Jackson, Lincoln, and Johnson. And I think what disappeared in Johnson's story, to me at any rate, was that 45 days was exactly what was going on in America when Johnson took, in this barely reunited nation, when Johnson took over that office. So give him some credit for holding it together. Give him F minus. Is there something lower than F? I don't know. Give him an F minus for his inability to see that he was being had by the radicals. But that sense of the centrality, the criticalness of the administration disappeared I mean, and all you saw was this sort of failed clown-like president who was the butt of many Thomas Nast cartoons. And in one, he's Othello, the other, he's a king, the other, these other things. So, I mean, basically all that fell away, and what you had was the president who missed but for one vote being impeached. And also that sort of, what his contribution to the war effort disappeared too. Everything disappeared with it. He just fell into this, I mean, Lincoln cast this huge shadow on both sides of it. James Buchanan, whose elementary school I went to, so of course I speak with authority about, deserves to stay in that shadow. I think Andy Johnson deserves to move out of it a little bit more.
We have a question in the chat, and that is, how would Hamlin have handled the first chapter in Reconstruction?
Boy, what an interesting question. What a very interesting question. I do not have an answer for that. I would think that Hamlin would have been much more protective of the gains, of the gains meant to be conferred on the former slave population. I think it would have been much more protective against the Jim Crow laws that quickly formed, the Black Codes that quickly formed. I think Hamlin was an inherent, what you would call a liberal of the day, and he was a Maine man. That's Joshua Chamberlain, Lawrence Chamberlain's territory up there. And he was a nuanced man. That's the other thing. I guess I hope I've made that point. Johnson had no nuance whatsoever. Hamlin was a much more nuanced man, and Lincoln simply made the determination that he could not win with him. So had Hamlin run and Lincoln lost, would have had George McClellan, and you can play what would happen with history then too.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Final question: what about the relationship with Grant?
That's another good question. Johnson wanted to make Grant the Secretary of War when he fired Stanton. Stanton wouldn't leave his office, so Grant was the Secretary of War, but not the Secretary of War. I didn't get the sense it was a troubled relationship, particularly any more than Johnson's relationship with others was troubled. I think Grant admired Johnson's effort to hold the Eastern Tennessee. And I think Grant was not in this way a deeply nuanced man either. And I suspect they had some things in common.
Howard, thank you so much. What a wonderful talk you've given us, and what a great start to this series on the presidency of Andrew Johnson. Thank you so much for being with us.
I'm flattered to be asked. Thank you for all of you who are there listening, and thanks to St. John's, and thanks to you, Clark. It was great fun.
Same here. Thank you so much.
Take care. Okay.